If you are an inquisitive history buff, you will definitely have a different view of Napoleon in this parallel universe. Because the work itself is an artistic manipulation of real history, and besides, no one experienced the real history. Perhaps the movie's Napoleon, who was born with a love brain and was occasionally used as a pawn in critical moments, is closer to a real, flesh and blood man than a legend. The movie opens in 1793. Marie, the wife of Louis XVI, is guillotined, an elegant woman who remains noble until her head hits the ground. She waits calmly for her fate to be pronounced, and perhaps the angry and frenzied people on the stage are just like grass in her eyes, for they have never been the ones to push history forward. The small, unassuming man in the crowd of onlookers seemed thoughtful. Napoleon was only an artillery commander at that time. Soon Napoleon waited for the opportunity to perform. In order to fight against the anti-French alliance, Napoleon formulated a battle plan for the siege of Toulon. He used the method of siege to surprise the British warships by shelling them from the walls of his rival city. As you can see in the movie, Napoleon was still nervous. The son of a peasant from Corsica had only one chance. The bloodied war horses in the movie map the cruelty of war. Perhaps it also foretells the ultimate end of his master's future. From this moment on, the man has made a soul contract with the devil. The success of the Battle of Toulon promoted Napoleon to the rank of brigadier general. This breakthrough promotion was also the only one of its kind in European military history. France at the time was a fickle political landscape. From September 27 to October 5, 1795, in just 9 days, the Royalists broke out in Paris in a series of organized armed rebellions. Seeing that the National Labor Union was about to collapse, Napoleon applied for the right to act on his own initiative. As the incited populace assembled, Napoleon decisively shelled the front rows, which were blown to a bloody pulp, and the back rows immediately dispersed. In the crowd, an old woman who had been injured by the blast was looking for her feet that had been blown off not far away. In that chaotic world, sometimes killing is instead a kind of mercy. One of the more unusual aspects of the movie is that it shows Napoleon's relatively lesser-known private life. He meets Josephine, a former noblewoman whose husband was guillotined during the Revolution, but who continues to socialize with the French elite. Although Napoleon was the most popular man in France at the time, in the eyes of the aristocracy, he was still just a warlord and a rascal. At a cocktail party, he is seduced by Josephine, who knows how men think. Josephine had actually heard of Napoleon, and on the one hand, she teased him, but on the other hand, she didn't seem to care. Although Napoleon was a veteran of the battlefield, he was a novice in the field of love. At least he had never slept with a French noblewoman. Faced with Josephine's seduction, Napoleon was quickly conquered. So the two got married without shame. Maybe this woman can really bring good luck to Napoleon. After that, Napoleon rose through the ranks of politics and had many military successes. Some important things get presented in the movie, like the Battle of the Pyramids, the Battle of the Three Emperors. But various famous battles like Napoleon leading his army into Italy in 1796 are not depicted. While Napoleon is fighting a bloody battle in Egypt, he does not forget to write love letters to Josephine, who is far away in Paris. At the same time, Josephine was sweating profusely in her own bed, fighting with her lover. The scandal was all over the newspapers, causing Napoleon, who was far away in Egypt, to be so irritated that he ran straight back to France to question his wife. After a tirade and a cry, instead of being estranged, the two fall even more in love. Perhaps it's such a military genius, coupled with rabid, brainless love hormones, that makes the perfect candidate to become a pawn. The governor's government impeached Napoleon for his malfeasance, but it happened to be the trigger for the Misty Moon coup that followed. In this way, an adultery made Napoleon become the first consul of France, ascending to the peak of power. Here seems to be a constant proof of how important it is to marry a woman who brings good luck. Is history really driven by these ridiculous trivialities? In real history, Josephine did do a lot for Napoleon's success in politics and aristocratic circles. The movie is very minimalistic and slapdash in explaining some of this. But in fact, far from enough to show Josephine clever maneuvering interpersonal relations, this woman has a lot of secrets. Napoleon carried out reforms in various areas such as political legislation, economy, and education, which are also omitted in the movie. The Napoleonic Code, which represents the interests of capital, was drafted and born at that time. 1804, Napoleon officially became emperor. The First French Republic ended and the First French Empire was born. Napoleon's reforms followed the interests of the capitalists, but being an emperor was more or less a retrograde step. But France at the time really needed an emperor to end the chaos, while on the other hand, some people didn't want an emperor who would rule forever. As the movie depicts, Napoleon proudly picked up his crown and put it on himself at his coronation. He didn't need anyone or religion to give him that divine right of kings. This high point is forever remembered in history and perhaps the beginning of a dark and murderous moment. Next came the Third Coalition against France. The most famous of these was the Battle of the Three Emperors, which ended in a complete victory for Napoleon. Austria and Russia were forced to sign unequal treaties. The victory at the Battle of the Three Emperors became the pinnacle of Napoleon and indeed of France. Half of Europe was controlled and conquered by Napoleon. However, at this time, that Josephine, who had had children with several people, was said to be infertile and unable to produce an heir for Napoleon. The two eventually divorced for the sake of the empire's utilization. Leaving that woman, Napoleon's good fortune seemed to leave her. 3 years later, in 1807, Russia broke the Treaty of Alliance with France. Napoleon felt this was a betrayal, so he led an expeditionary force of 600,000 men in 12 different languages and marched to Moscow. There should have been more than just betrayal. Perhaps at this point Napoleon was too powerful to be a pawn in the full control of the big bosses. This also became a major turning point in Napoleon's life. The excessively long front also made it completely impossible to keep up with supplies, and soldiers died of starvation and disease on a daily basis. It was hard to push through to Moscow, only to have the Russians move out and set Moscow on fire the entire time. Such a scorched earth policy caused Napoleon's army to lose many more men without being resupplied in the dead city. Many more soldiers were frozen to death on the road by the extreme cold. There were even cases of soldiers cutting off their thighs to feed themselves. Napoleon crusaded with an army of 670,000, only to come back with only 20,000 men left, leaving Napoleon's popularity plummeting across Europe. This was followed by the much larger Sixth Coalition against France. But the movie jumps right to Napoleon being forced to give up the throne and stranded on Elba. However, what made Napoleon decide to rise again was the news in the newspaper 10 months later that Josephine was dating the King of Prussia. Josephine, the bait, still pulls the big fish and rewrites history. Unable to control his emotions, Napoleon returned to France again. Faced with troops aiming their guns, Napoleon stripped off his coat and stood alone in front of the guns. The soldiers actually lowered their guns and soon all joined Napoleon's camp. I don't think anyone on this planet, except Napoleon, would be so sure that not one of so many guns would fire. If we hypothesize that the men in front of us are actually Masonic brothers who have long since infiltrated the military, then things make sense. Napoleon regained power again. But at this time Josephine also died of illness, leaving Napoleon devastated. And at this time there was a voice in all of Europe that Napoleon was the root cause of the chaos in Europe and the culprit of the war. So the European countries soon formed the Seventh Coalition against France. The Battle of Waterloo became the farewell performance of Napoleon's military career, ending with a great defeat and surrender. The movie also shows the Battle of Waterloo as the Armageddon. Although the Battle of Waterloo is relatively small among the battles in which Napoleon participated in his life, with less than 100,000 people on both sides, it was of great significance to Napoleon. The director through the transportation and scheduling of the whole process of the battle step clear, pattern perspective of large and small have shown. The Battle of Waterloo was created as if it was the biggest epic battle of Napoleon's military career. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, he was exiled to an island called St. Helena. 6 years later in 1821, Napoleon fell ill and died, thus ending his life of mixed reviews. but from what the movie is trying to convey, he was poisoned. Napoleon was involved in commanding 81 battles in his life, and the movie only takes out 6 of his. The timeline of the movie is very long, from Napoleon's rise to his death, from military politics to love. The intensity of the narrative is impressive, as is the fast pace. If there seems to be a slight flaw in the movie, it's that the main character, Napoleon, looks slightly haggard and aged. Perhaps the daytime battles and the nightly sexual encounters with Joseph have drained his vitality. In fact, Joaquin Phoenix, who plays Napoleon, is in his 70s, and it's a miracle that he can do such physical work at such an advanced age. Everyone is familiar with Joaquin Phoenix's role as the clown, the man who smiles and kills with a gas bottle, the puppet who sells his soul to the devil, and who plays a tragedy like a comedy with his characteristic banter and black humor. And our Napoleon is actually the same. In fact, in the eyes of those who were invaded, he is also a devil. Joaquin Phoenix takes away all those airs of Napoleon as a leader's demeanor. Let the character of Napoleon reattach a new interpretation of his own understanding. Especially when Joaquin Phoenix laughs like a clown, he seems to be laughing at himself, not realizing that the clown of his life is himself. There are 2 other strands that run throughout the movie. One is the infiltration of secret societies, which is not overly depicted, but vaguely gives a sense of the chilling hand behind it. In fact, there are secret societies behind Napoleon's successes and failures. The historic encounter between Josephine and Napoleon was originally a deliberate arrangement by someone. Napoleon's brother Joseph Bonaparte, the man who changed the fate of Napoleon and France, was in fact the general tutor of the French Grand Orient Lodge of Freemasonry at that time. Only 2 simple facts are stated here. Napoleon's sweep across Europe allowed Masonic power to blossom throughout Europe, thus beginning the era of Freemasonry in Europe. And Napoleon's defeat allowed a certain mysterious family to make astronomical fortunes in the British Treasury bond market. Can't say their name here, or they'll send UFOs and lizard people to attack me. Just kidding. Those may not be your cup of tea, so let's talk about something else. Another strand of the movie is the love affair between Napoleon and Josephine. In fact, every man has a Napoleon living in his heart, but even if he becomes a Napoleon, he is still a child at heart, and still needs a little bit of tenderness to comfort his life. Maybe the real history is too cruel, and the fragrance and whitewash are some embellishments under the grayness of suffering, like a cup of bitter coffee with a little sugar. And about the peach blossom, gender these topics, is the theme of any era. It will always be talked about. Since no one can change anything, let's revel in it. Focus on Joseph's ample breasts, on the titillating backside. If you like this video, please also subscribe and retweet. I'm the whole recaps. See you next time.